The sound that awoke me that night is still fresh in my mind. There was no storm. It wasn't the creak of our old farmhouse walls or the bark of the neighbor's restless dog. It was the sound of boots. Heavy boots. They were too many, stomping the gravel like a miniature army. When I looked through the window, my heart stopped. A half-dozen men and women were standing there with clipboards in their hands like weapons and reflective vests that shone in the porch light. Even though they weren't police, they wanted to act like it. The president of our HOA, a woman who wore power-like perfume, stood at the front of the pack. She had that same smug smile she always carried, the one that said, "You live here because I allow it." But this time, she wasn't just here to fine us for the trash cans or to scold us for having visitors after 9 p.m. This time, she was here for him, for my fiancé. Before I take you deeper into this story, drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the twists that follow. She raised her hand like a commander, and her voice carried sharp across the yard.
Run outside.
The two of you. This is an official order. I felt my stomach twist. I grabbed my fiancé's arm. "What's going on?" I whispered, panic clawing at my throat. He did not immediately respond. He just stood, calm, steady, eyes fixed on them like he had seen this all before. The president stepped forward. "You are under arrest," she announced, every syllable dripping with arrogance. "Community law violations on multiple occasions. Tonight we take you into custody." Custody. The word sliced through me. I wanted to yell, laugh, and protest simultaneously. Custody. These were neighbors, volunteers, people who pushed paper and thought their rules were right. They weren't police. They were not arbitrators. They weren't anything but people who loved control. And yet, in that moment, my fiancé didn't resist. He didn't argue. He ignored the meaningless clicking of the cheap metal cuffs around his wrists. I felt hot tears sting my eyes. "Do something," I begged him. "Please." But then he turned to me just for a second, and the look in his eyes stopped me cold. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't desperate. He wasn't broken. There was a fire there, a contained, quiet fire. A message unspoken. Trust me. Wait. I didn't understand it then. All I could feel was terror, shame, and anger boiling inside me. However, the fact that the man they were escorting around in handcuffs was not your typical homeowner was something neither I nor the HOA were aware of. He wasn't just my fiancé. He had sworn to uphold the law, and the game they were playing was about to shatter. From the moment we moved into that neighborhood, I thought we had found peace. The streets were lined with neat rows of oak trees that seemed to bend toward each other, forming archways of green. Every blade of grass was neatly trimmed to look like soldiers forming a line. The lawns stretched out like perfect carpets. Fresh paint, polished shutters, and driveways that were free of oil stains gave each house the appearance of being on the cover of a magazine. It was beautiful. Too beautiful. At first I convinced myself it was comforting, safe, like we were part of something larger, something orderly. I would think, this is it, as I sat on the porch swing with a cup of coffee. This is the lifestyle I've always desired. But beauty can be a mask, and ours was hiding something ugly. Little things were the beginning. A folded letter slipped into the mailbox, warning us about leaving our trash cans out past collection day. It felt harmless, like a polite reminder. A second letter followed, this one written in bold red ink, and accusing us of having unapproved decorations on the porch. My fiancé had strung up a simple wind chime that was apparently non-conforming. I laughed it off at first. Even though I could tell his smile didn't reach his eyes, he also laughed. He was not a man who was easily upset, but he had seen enough in his job to know when someone was using power to show they could. The HOA wasn't about community. It wasn't about keeping the neighborhood safe or tidy. It had to do with control. They wanted obedience. Blind, unquestioned obedience. I started noticing the way our neighbors changed, depending on who was watching. A friendly wave when it was just us. But if the HOA president was nearby, that same neighbor stiffened, avoided eye contact, and hurried along like a soldier under inspection. It was unsettling, but I kept telling myself, we're fine. We follow the rules. We'll keep the peace. But the peace was an illusion, because no amount of compliance was ever sufficient. There was always another notice, a further violation, another fine. I observed my fiancé staring at the most recent envelope in the driveway one evening. The paper shook just slightly in his hands. He wasn't angry, not yet, but I could see the weight pressing down on him. "What now?" I asked softly. "They're fining us," he said, voice flat, "because the grass was 1 inch too high." I surveyed the yard. Totally green. perfectly cut, perfectly ordinary. It looked no different from anyone else's. They measured it, he added, almost in disbelief. They actually brought a ruler. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about rules. It was about breaking us down, one paper cut at a time. The neighborhood wasn't paradise. It wasn't safety. It was a cage, a perfect polished prison. And though I didn't know it yet, the prison guards were just getting started. If the HOA thought they could break us with paper threats and fines, they underestimated the man I was engaged to. My fiancé wasn't just strong in the physical sense, though he carried himself with the kind of quiet strength that turned heads. His strength came from his calm, his ability to remain steady when the world tilted sideways. It was the kind of strength that didn't need to raise its voice. He had a saying he lived by: respect is earned, not demanded. We were sitting on the back porch at sunset when he first told me that. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass, and the fading sky burned orange and pink. He leaned back in his chair, sipping his coffee, and said it as though it were the simplest truth in the world. Respect isn't about titles or rules, he explained. It all comes down to how you treat others. If you need to force someone to respect you, then you don't deserve it. I carried those thoughts with me. They became a lens through which I saw everything in our neighborhood. And once I looked through that lens, I couldn't unsee it. Respect was not wanted by the HOA, they wanted obedience. They prowled like hawks. I would catch them walking the sidewalks at odd hours, not to enjoy the evening air but to take notes, to snap pictures, to build their cases against us. It wasn't just annoying, it was invasive, like we were under surveillance in our own home. I tried to ignore it, but there were moments when it became impossible. Once, I stepped outside to water the plants, only to see the HOA president herself standing across the street, arms folded, eyes locked on me like a predator watching prey. No smile, no gesture, just watching. I froze, hose in hand, water spilling over the edge of the flower pot. It wasn't neighborly concern. It wasn't friendliness. It was suspicion. And suspicion had become their default setting, especially toward him. My fiancé carried himself differently from everyone else in that community. While others bowed their heads and muttered apologies at the smallest correction, he met the HOA's stares with steady eyes. He never picked fights, never raised his voice, never acted out of anger. However, they were enraged by that composed confidence. They wanted fear. They desired compliance. And when they didn't get it from him, they sharpened their claws. I began to notice the trivial escalation. We'd receive warnings for cars parked too close to the curb, even though they were perfectly within the lines. Notes accusing us of disturbances when we had only been laughing together on the porch. And then the most ridiculous of all, a citation claiming we had unauthorized gatherings because my sister stopped by for dinner. It was harassment, plain and simple. But through it all, my fiancé remained calm. Every time I felt my blood boil, ready to storm into the HOA office and demand answers, he'd place his hand gently over mine. "Not yet," he'd say softly. "Let them show who they really are." Those words frustrated me at times. I wanted to fight back, to scream at the injustice. But he knew something I didn't. Patience was not a sign of weakness. Patience was power. But I couldn't ignore how the HOA's eyes were following us. At the grocery store, at the neighborhood park, even walking our dog down the street, their gaze lingered, calculating, judging. It wasn't just oversight anymore. It was obsession. And while I didn't know it at the time, their obsession was leading to something darker, something none of us could have predicted. Because when people who crave power feel it slipping away, they don't back down. They strike harder. And soon, they would aim their hardest strike at him. At us, it started out as paper. Letters in our mailbox. Slips of warnings tucked under our doormat. Neatly typed notices on crisp white paper, all signed with the HOA's seal like it meant something more than ink and arrogance. At first, we treated them like what they were, annoyances, little storms we could laugh off. Paper, on the other hand, has a way of stacking up so high that it becomes weight. And gradually, that burden began to impose itself on our lives. I'll never forget the night my fiancé came home with a thick envelope in his hand. He dropped it on the kitchen table, and the contents spilled like a deck of cards: citations, warnings, fines. "What is this time for?" I was already getting ready when I asked. He sifted through them, his jaw tightening. "It appears that our porch light does not meet the required wattage. The recycling bin was too close to the curb. And—" he paused, shaking his head in disbelief. "They claim that I was loitering." "Loitering? In your own driveway?" He did not respond. He did not have to. His face was etched with the truth. No longer were the rules relevant to this. This was about me. He was the target of the HOA's attention. They were testing boundaries and waiting for him to stray, like wolves circling prey. However, he never fell. He remained composed, steady. He felt like rain falling from his shoulders. Up until the night, they didn't go far enough. After a late dinner with friends, we still laughed when we got home. Warm and inviting light shone from the porch. However, there was something that thawed me and was nailed to the door. A warning. The bold black letters screamed at us. "Cease and desist. Trespassing in your own driveway." My heart raced as I stared at it with a dry mouth. This doesn't even make sense," I whispered. "They're accusing me of trespassing on my own property," he said quietly, reading it again. If it hadn't felt so threatening, it would have been laughable in its absurdity. The language was precise and deliberate, not only a citation but also an accusation. Then I saw it. A handwritten line in red ink at the bottom. "Next step, enforcement." As I held onto the paper, my hands trembled. Enforcement? What exactly did that imply? I looked at him, desperate for reassurance. He stood there, silent, the notice dangling from his fingers. My anchor had always been his calm, but even anchors can sink when they are too heavy. "Say something," I pleaded. "Do something." He met my eyes, steady, unflinching. "Not yet. No, not yet." Those two words echoed in my chest, hollow and heavy, because deep down I knew what he meant. The HOA was not finished. They had not completed their games. Additionally, the subsequent action would not be written down. The next move would come in flesh and blood. The chains were no longer just signs. In the pitch black, they were footsteps. They were whispers on the street. They were neighbors who were too afraid to look at us. The rules had become weapons, and soon, those weapons would be drawn. It was a little past midnight when I woke to the sound. Not the hum of the fridge, not the creak of the ceiling fan. This was more intense. The mechanical clatter of flashlights, the low murmur of voices outside, and the boots crunching gravel. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, straining to listen. Alongside me, my fiancé shook. "Hear that?" I asked. I whispered. He didn't answer with words. With straight shoulders and deliberate movements, he simply slid out of bed. What I saw as I followed him to the window made my stomach turn. They were here. A group of HOA members, half a dozen of them, stood in our yard, reflective vests glowing under the porch light. Others carried clipboards, while others waved flashlights like batons. At the center was the HOA president, her posture tall and rigid, eyes gleaming with something I can only describe as hunger. My fiancé exhaled slowly, as if this was the moment he'd been waiting for. "What are they doing?" I asked, panic already rising in my throat. Before he could answer, a booming voice cut through the night. "Step outside, both of you." I froze. They didn't just knock. They were not asking. They were in charge. Stabilizing me, my fiancé reached for my hand. Although his touch was calm and reassuring, my pulse sped up to the point where I couldn't breathe. As if it were a badge of authority, the president held up her clipboard. She pointed at him and declared, "You are hereby under arrest for repeated violations of community law. Tonight, we take you into custody." In shock, I blinked as my brain tried to process the absurdity. Arrest? Custody? By them? They weren't police officers. Even without security, they were not there. They were neighbors who lacked control and had too much power. I grabbed his arm. "This is absurd. Refuse them. Tell them they can't." But he didn't resist. He stepped onto the porch, opened the door, and confronted them with an unimaginable calmness. The cold night air wrapped around us, and all I could hear was the frantic beating of my own heart. "Hands behind your back," one of them ordered, a man whose shaky voice betrayed his false confidence. And then I heard it. The metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut. I couldn't stop the gasp that tore from my throat. My fiancé, the man who had protected me, who had always been the rock I leaned on, was standing there, wrists bound by neighbors pretending to wield justice, my vision blurred with tears. Rage burned in my chest. "You cannot achieve this," I yelled. "This isn't legal." The president smirked, her lips curling in satisfaction. "We make the law here," she said coldly, "and no one is above it." She said something that made me feel uneasy. She believed it. She truly believed her clipboard gave her more power than the truth, more power than the law itself. But then I noticed it. My fiancé's eyes. Not fear, avoid panic. Not even anger. Behind his calm expression was the same steady fire. Just enough to meet my gaze, he turned his head slightly, and without speaking, he told me everything I needed to know. trust me. He had given me the same look each time I had doubts or wanted to fight back too soon. He wasn't surrendering. He was standing by, waiting for the moment everything would turn. My hands were clenched at the sides as they led him toward the clubhouse. My body shook with rage and helplessness. I wanted to scream and remove his wrist cuffs to show the madness of it all. But he walked calmly, every step measured, every breath even, like a man who already knew how this story would end. Even though I didn't realize it at the time, the conclusion was nearer than anyone anticipated. Because they believed they were breaking him, the HOA, but what they were really doing was digging their own grave. The so-called hearing was held in the HOA clubhouse, though that night it looked more like a kangaroo court than a meeting hall. Folding chairs were arranged in rows. A long table stood at the front, where the board members sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces stern with manufactured authority. Neighbors had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Eyes darted between the HOA president and my fiancé in his handcuffs as others clutched coffee mugs or whispered nervously. Phones glowed as a few dared to record, the tension humming like an electric current in the air. The president slammed her clipboard down on the table as if it were a gavel. "You stand accused," she announced, her voice shrill with false power. "Community law violations on a regular basis. Unauthorized gatherings, trespassing, disturbances of peace. Tonight, we make a decision." The room rang with her words. However, instead of feeling fear, my chest was boiling with rage. I wanted to scream that this wasn't a courtroom, that her laws were nothing more than rules scribbled in a neighborhood handbook. However, my fiancé's calm voice cut through the background noise before I could speak. "Are you finished?" The room stilled. The president blinked, thrown off by his composure. "Excuse me?" He raised his cuffed hand slightly, the metal clinking in the silence. His steady, unflinching, commanding eyes swept the room. "You've had your fun," he said evenly. "However, playtime has ended." And then he did something that silenced every whisper, every rustle, every breath in that room. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his jacket pocket. The cuffs rattled, but his fingers found what they sought. He pulled out his wallet, flipped it open, and held it up for all to see. The badge glinted under the harsh fluorescent lights. Real, heavy. Authority that didn't need permission from a clipboard. "I'm a sworn police officer," he said, voice low but powerful. "And what you've done tonight, unlawful detention, harassment, impersonating officers, it's more than a violation. It's a crime." The air cracked like thunder. Neighbors gasped. Someone dropped their phone, the clatter ringing in the stunned silence. A man in the back muttered, "Oh my God!" The president's face drained of color. She stumbled over her words. This doesn't look like it." But it was exactly what it looked like. Her empire of fear, her illusion of power, shattered in an instant beneath the weight of that badge. For months they had stalked, threatened, fined, and harassed us, convinced they were untouchable. But now the truth stood before them, undeniable. "You think you make the law here?" my fiancé continued, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "But the law doesn't bend to your will. It doesn't answer to your fear tactics. And it doesn't stop at the neighborhood's edge." He leaned forward, eyes locked on the president. "You crossed a line, and now you answer for it." The room erupted. Neighbors who had been silent for so long began whispering, shouting, pointing fingers. Some cheered. Others scrambled to distance themselves from the board. The fear that had kept everyone silent had vanished with the illusion. The president collapsed back into her chair, pale and trembling. She didn't have control for the first time, and I stood frozen, heart pounding, tears streaming down my cheeks, not from fear, but from something else. Relief, vindication, pride. Because in that moment, I saw the man I loved not just as my fiancé, not just as the calm anchor I leaned on, but as a protector who carried truth in his hands, even when the world tried to chain him. The badge didn't just change the room, it changed everything. The silence after the reveal didn't last long. It started with a single voice from the back of the room. A man stood, clutching his phone. "I knew it," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "I knew you couldn't do half of what you said you could." Then another voice, sharper, louder. "You fined me 3 times because the color of my fence was wrong. You said you'd take my property if I didn't pay." The floodgates opened. One by one, neighbors rose from their chairs, their fear melting into fury. They had been quiet for so long, afraid of retaliation, afraid of fines, afraid of being the next target. But now, with the illusion broken, their voices surged like a wave crashing against a crumbling dam. "You threatened to evict my parents. You said I couldn't have my grandchildren come over. You lied about calling the city inspector. I checked." Every accusation chipped away at the board's facade. The president shrank in her chair, her once smug posture collapsing under the weight of truth. She tried to shout them down, but her words were drowned in the rising roar of voices. And then came the moment that changed everything. A woman with a pile of papers in her hand stood up. Her hands shook, but her voice carried strength. "These are letters," she said, holding them high. "Letters from the HOA demanding money that was never owed, threatening legal action, threatening foreclosure. I kept every single one. And I'm not the only one." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Heads nodded. Murmurs of agreement spread like wildfire. My fiancé stepped forward, his presence anchoring the chaos. "This ends tonight," he said firmly. "I've already documented everything. The events that took place here will be reported. Every false fine, every unlawful threat, every abuse of power. You're done." The board members shifted uncomfortably, whispering to one another like cornered animals. The treasurer tugged at his collar, sweat beading on his forehead. One of the others slammed her notebook shut, her hands trembling. However, the president, she made one final attempt. "This is slander," she screeched, her voice cracking. "We built this community. We kept it safe, kept it clean, kept it orderly. This place would collapse without us." Her words hung in the air, desperate and hollow. And then, silence, because everyone in that room knew the truth. The community hadn't thrived because of them. Despite them, it had continued to exist. Neighbors who had once avoided our eyes now turned to us, their faces filled with something I hadn't seen before. Hope. The empire's cracks were no longer cracks. They were fissures, spreading fast, unstoppable. The fear had vanished. There was an end to the silence. And the mighty HOA, the self-proclaimed rulers of our perfect little prison, were watching their kingdom burn down around them. My fiancé didn't raise his voice. He did not have to. His words had already tipped the scales, and truth had done the rest. All that was left now was justice. The night didn't end in that clubhouse. It carried into the days and weeks that followed, like echoes rolling across a canyon, each one louder than the last. The police were called, not by the board or the HOA, but by the oppressed individuals. Neighbors who had once stayed silent now lined up with statements, evidence, and stories that stretched back years. The badge had done more than reveal the truth. It had given people the courage to speak it. Investigations opened. Complaints stacked higher than the HOA's rulebooks. Fines were traced, records uncovered, funds unaccounted for. And suddenly, the board that once strutted through our streets like royalty found themselves answering questions not from fearful residents, but from real authorities. The president, once the voice that echoed like thunder at every meeting, now barely whispered her defense. No one leaned in to listen. No one rallied to her side. Fear had been the foundation of her power, and when fear vanished, so did her empire. I watched it all unfold. Papers served, hearings scheduled, resignations handed in under shaking hands. And through it all, I stood beside the man they had tried to humiliate, the man they thought they could break. But they didn't know him. They didn't know the strength it takes to wear that badge, to carry its weight every day, not for pride, but for protection. They were unaware of his calm rage when confronted with injustice. They didn't know that the quiet man they mocked was built of steel that no chain could hold. And they didn't know me either, because I wasn't just the fiancé dragged into their petty war. I wasn't the only woman they were attempting to intimidate with fines and threats. I was the one who stood in the shadows of that room and watched their empire collapse, brick by brick, lie by lie. I saw what fear can do, but I also saw what happens when fear is replaced by courage. That night didn't just expose an HOA. It exposed something bigger, something we all need to remember. Power built on fear is fragile. Power built on truth cannot be broken. And here's the truth. No matter how small you feel, no matter how big their threats, no matter how heavy their lies, silence is the weapon that keeps them strong. The moment you speak, the moment you refuse to bow, the moment you hold up your truth, the empire cracks. So let this story be more than words. Let it be a reminder. Stand, speak. Refuse to be silenced. Because sometimes the world won't change until you demand it. That night, they tried to arrest my fiancé. They tried to break us. They tried to remind us that in their world, they made the rules. But they forgot one thing. He wasn't just a man in love. He was an officer of the law. And when they chained his wrists, They chained themselves to their own downfall. The badge changed everything, and the truth, our truth, set us free.